Well, I've sort of run out of questions, but I'm wondering, is there any more that you feel would be good to get out into this interview?
Yeah, I think two things is that with this group of patients, like my title, it's co-creating safety. Um, but to really understand that patients need to feel safe in their body in order safe to explore. And we tend not to focus enough on how patients experience anxiety in the body. It'll really make all the difference in the world so that people who read the book will learn how to assess anxiety in the body. And just if they only read the anxiety chapter alone, they're going to be making patients feel safe in the body, and it's going to make it a much easier journey. You want patients to feel some anxiety, not too little, not too much. And in this book, it talks about what's that optimal level of anxiety, so you can really titrate your work for that. And
Yeah.
the other thing is, although I knew about projection, I heard about projection when I was starting as a therapist, there really was very little said about how to identify it, how to work with it. And with this kind of patient, there's so many kinds of projections that it's really important to be able to understand and read what those projections are. Because if we don't deactivate the projection, the patient is going to be interacting with the projection instead of relating to you. And very, very often we have these kind of subtle misalliances that can go on for quite a while in the treatment because the therapist just doesn't understand what that projection is. Just yesterday, I supervised a case in Poland, and there was a patient who was projecting her will onto the therapist, assumed that the therapist wanted to look at certain issues and that the therapist was concerned about her difficulties. And I pointed out that the patient was just waiting for the therapist to guide the process. And then the patient herself was a little bit afraid and angry at this therapist who she thought was driving the therapy. So in a way, she just had to say, I have no right to look at anything here unless it's something you'd like to look at for your own benefit. And so we need to find out what you would like to look at here that you think would be helpful to you. And that you might have to do that for 10, 20, maybe even more minutes until the patient really can declare what they want and that the therapy now starts to be guided by the patient's will. It's really important to remember that it has to be the patient's will driving the therapy. It can't be your will. Otherwise,
And I would imagine that it's going to keep coming back around to that. It's not like you can communicate that just once.
exactly. Well, and I'm so glad you brought that up because, in a sense, what you're helping the listeners see is you and I are talking about therapy. Now, but when students assume that if they just deal with something, that it's gone forever, that's not therapy. That's called magic. And that happens in some other building and on some other podcast. But
Yeah.
this is the therapy podcast, not the magic podcast. In magic, yes, we wish that some magical intervention would have magical power and the patient's problems about will would disappear, or that after this session, the patient would no longer project. That's magic. But
I think that I remember back when I was a student, you would read these case histories by well-known psychotherapists, and so you'd have in your mind this image of the perfect therapist.
yeah. And that perfect therapist never failed, always knew what to do, and his interventions just had this magical power.
Yeah.
And then you start working, and you think, where's the magic?
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate the way that that your work and others that are aligned with this approach, that over time it's become very nuanced, and it's not throwing away all of the wisdom and learning of the past, but rather fine tuning it. And I like your closing view about the value of this book, as I understand it. It's going to help fine tune for therapists some of the interventions that they make.